talked about how to run Android apps and modify them and find some vulnerabilities like bad network transmissions that aren't encrypted properly. And logically, especially if you were running a company, rather than this manual dynamic testing, you'd probably like to run a scanner. And here's a scanner, one of the possible scanners. Let me just make a folder just for this. Okay, so you just clone this scanner called AndroBugs, and that gives you the tool. All right, now I'm going to get an app, which is that Genie MD app that we saw used broken HTTPS to communicate with the internet. So you could put a man-in-the-middle attack like burp, and it would not detect that. So it'll cheerfully use the wrong key to encrypt data. And then you just run this thing with Python, and it scans the app looking for common flaws, just like many other vulnerability scanners. And there it goes. Looks like it's working fine. First it calculates hashes of the app, and then it's eventually going to find a list of vulnerabilities. Going to print out a long report file name, which we can then view in an editor, so we can search through it. But I'm now doing consulting for a major corporation. In fact, one of the ones where I found vulnerabilities in their app, and this is what they do, of course. If you want to be a company, they standardize on some commercial scanners, and they train their coders. You really have to write code that will scan clean in the scanner. That is clearly the reasonable way to secure apps at a company scale, And I don't know if this is necessarily the best scanner, but it gives you it's free, and it gives you a good example of what these scanners are like. The problem with these vulnerability scanners is they give you a very long report with a lot of false positives and a lot of repetition. But they do find a lot of the vulnerabilities, and getting rid of these is certainly a good move. According to these instructions, it'll only take a minute or so. I hope that's true. We're going to see. A little bit of action. And you just feed it the APK file, and it's unpacking it and then looking through the code for suspicious lines of code. I don't think it's running it. I think it's just doing a code review. So this is like Checkmarks. Checkmarks is the commercial tool I'm using in some of my consulting jobs that looks through source code. Okay, it's done, and it's found things. And you see it did find some SSL flaws. And there's a report here with this ridiculous long file name. And you can examine it in an editor like Nano to make it so you can search through it. That's what I did. And now you can go through it. So the app is using a runtime exec, which is interesting. It's executing command line commands. So that would suggest that there's actually a command injection vulnerability in here, which I did not find, but it might be there. The code suggests that you might be able to do command injection here like we did a couple days ago. You can just inject like Linux commands and execute them. And then something about the key store not protected by password, which is interesting. And here's the SSL implementation checking, verifying host name and fields. It doesn't check the validation of the common name of the certificate. And this is the vulnerability we talked about. Then they call it critical, and I think they're right, where your HTTPS does not verify who you're sending the data to. It just cheerfully lets you send the data to the wrong target with a different common name, and that's ridiculous. And there's various ways it writes this SSL vulnerability. So it did find the important vulnerability I know about, and some other things that might be bad. WebView remote code execution is from having a web. This is in the textbook, which I mentioned, the Mobile Application Hacker's Handbook. There's a thing called WebView that lets you put a web browser inside your app. And you can turn on this thing called Add JavaScript Interface, and then JavaScript from a web page can execute Java commands in the system. So it makes it possible for your website to do really powerful things. It's very analogous to Microsoft's ActiveX functionality that lets your browser run raw system commands, but it's also considered very dangerous. And so people don't recommend it. But a lot of people developed for a long time using this, just like you might execute command line commands as part of your app. It was a way to make your web page more powerful, but considered too dangerous, and it is using this dangerous technique. All right. Then there are a couple of warnings, not so hot, and notices, no big deal. Anyway, so that's what I wanted to show you. There's a flag of some kind to find here, but that's just running a scanner is probably the most reasonable way to find vulnerabilities for most people. It's nice to learn how to find them manually, but if you want to have a consistent, reproducible process at a company, using some kind of vuln scanner is the standard. So I'll stop this one.